briefly, what is the history of Piaseczno Hasidut and that of the Rebbe's life before World War II?
Oh, sure. Okay, so Piaseczno Hasidut really begins with this Rebbe, the Piaseczno Rebbe. His lineage comes primarily from Grodzisk, and so related to that particular type of Hasidei Chagas. Actually, one of the best people to ask that particular question is not on our conversation now, but Daniel Reiser, my colleague in Israel, who published a remarkable 2-volume series, critical annotated version of the Aish Kodesh itself. He has some excellent bibliographic material there on the background on Grodzisk and the influence, especially in the second edition of his work. But what happened was there was as is not uncommon, a little bit of a division as to who should lead the community after the Rebbe's father passed away. There were 2 significant contenders. One of them was the Rebbe himself, who was rather young at the time, but as was his way, he chose not to accept, the traditional court, and he moved himself to Warsaw and nearby Piaseczno, which is a very small town, about 5,000 people, about 14 kilometers outside of Warsaw. And he divided his time between the yeshiva that he built in Warsaw, which is a very significant yeshiva, a very large yeshiva called Das Moshe, and the rest of the year he spent in this little village, Piaseczno. And so that particular town became, as it were, the founding court. And except for the transplanted Piaseczno Hasidim in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, that was the initiation of the Piaseczno movement.
Who was Emanuel Ringenblum, and what was the Oneg Shabbat project?
Can I go back to the last question?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Because you asked me really 2 questions there. One was, how did Piaseczno Hasidus start? And then a little bit about the Rebbe's life before World War II. And I basically only answered the first part. I would love to say something about the second part, because it's brilliant and huge and really important what the Rebbe had in mind. With your permission.
Absolutely.
Sure. So the Rebbe had a rather radical and revolutionary approach to the problems of 20th century Judaism in Eastern Europe. He felt that Hasidus had become quite stagnant in central Poland in particular, and he argued that a lot of the norms that had been established over the 19th century really had to be revisited and broken down again. He felt that the yeshivas were no longer adequately serving the population, who were fractionating themselves, and the youth in particular were separating off into various political movements, communist movements, Zionist movements, all kinds of movements that were either neutral towards, or even worse, antithetical towards traditional lifestyle of the Hasidic orientation. And so he wanted to start things all over again. And he had a massive plan that was basically going to be a combination of a series of books that would go along with a small social movement. And he actually managed to put these things into play, and it was unfortunately truncated by World War II. But the book that appeared, that was the first in the series, is the so-called Chovas HaTalmidim, which I mentioned a few moments ago in connection with Rabbi Nachman Bowman Zatzal. The Chovas HaTalmidim, published in 1932, the translation of the title is A Student's Obligation, or The Obligation of the Student, is an amazing book that's essentially directed at 10 to 12-year-old boys. And it's a manual for how to grow spiritually, how to orient yourself towards becoming, spiritually at your potential. And even though it's written for adolescents, it's totally brilliant and completely applicable to adults. I constantly learn quite a bit from it every time I review it. There is an introduction at the beginning that's directed to parents and teachers to explain their role in this process. And then, of course, there are these amazing 3 Kabbalistic essays at the end, which is what I studied with Rabbi Bowman in particular. And his idea was to start from the youth and slowly mold them through his literary efforts to become these spiritual giants. He planned and actually wrote two more books in this series, which were buried along with the Aish Kodesh that we'll discuss shortly in the Warsaw Ghetto, and were discovered and were published after the war. So we actually have his whole spiritual plan from about the age 10 or 12 of the subject up until the age of young married and in Kollel, like early 20s, 26, 27. And it's absolutely fascinating. At the same time, he also planned to seed specific towns in Eastern Europe with extremely dedicated, focused groups of Hasidim who would gather nightly for a rigorous discussion of spiritual matters and to support each other spiritually, psychologically, financially, and to grow the Hasidic communities in those towns. If it sounds a lot like Chabad, it should, because I think much of the Chabad model of shlichut is probably not consciously modeled on the Piaseczno model, because he intended it to be secret. But we know quite a bit about it because he wrote a very small book that outlined his plan called B'nai Machshava Tova. And he considered this book such a holy achievement that he wouldn't even have it printed in Poland. He had it printed in Jerusalem and then shipped back to Poland, and 12 copies were circulated. Luckily, amazingly, one of them survived the war, and the people who owned it consulted with the Ger Rebbe, who said that yes, it should be published, it should be made available to the wider world. And so we have his whole plan laid out in exactly how you set up these communities, what you're supposed to do when you get together on a nightly level, rules of discipline, conduct. Absolutely fantastic. So much more to say about that. But that was kind of like the way he planned his life. And then, of course, World War II. And that, I hope, answers your question a little more